Good morning, everyone. Hello and welcome to the third BangkokEdge Festival, second day of it. My name is Dimpy. I'm taking care of this room with Masti today. We have three book launches today in this room. One had to be cancelled. The speaker couldn't come from Hong Kong. And we end the festival actually with the launch of the Changing Climate, Changing Lives 2020 Film Festival tonight. So I hope you can be there for all of these events. So we start off the day with our first book, Radical Thought Thai Mind, A History of Revolutionary Ideology in Traditional Society by Kun Paul and Kun Yuangrat Wedel. Please give them a round of applause for...
Really, we should be applauding you for braving both coronavirus and PM and the difficulties of getting around in Bangkok to join us. So we're very grateful to have you with us today. We're going to talk for about 20 or 25 minutes, and we have some slides that'll give you some of the highlights from the book. And then we'll open it up to questions. And we look forward to having some interesting ones. สำหรับคนไทยที่อยู่เนี่ยถ้าจะถามเป็นภาษาไทยเราก็ยินดีที่จะตอบเป็นภาษาไทยด้วย So without further ado, let's get started.
Thank you, Paul. I just have to thank you, like Paul said, all of you who sacrificed your time and risk of all the virus in Bangkok, you know, the dust and the Corona. I think you really risk yourself to come here. Okay, our book is based on interviews and research going back to the 1970s, when I was a professor at Thammasat and Ramkhamhaeng, and then the research fellow at Southeast Asian Studies, Singapore. And Paul was a correspondent for UPI, covering the communist insurgency. Over the past 3 years, we conducted additional interviews and took advantage of newly scholarly material to explain the history of radical thought in Thailand.
Ideas are important, and we start our book with a quote from John Maynard Keynes. He wrote, "The ideas of economists and political philosophers, both when they're right and when they're wrong, are more powerful than is commonly thought. Indeed, the world is ruled by little else." Now, Thais are often considered to be non-ideological, with little interest in ideas. Perhaps attendance at this Bangkok Festival of Ideas is one point in opposition to that. Our research also showed that over the last century, political, social, and economic ideas have played critical roles in Thai matters, in history, in conflicts, in government. In particular, the differences between the traditional Thai worldview and the ideas from the West have often been the basis of conflict and disruption. That conflict has been worsened by misunderstanding and distortion of some of those ideas from the West. But perhaps the most important influence on radical thinking has been repression by traditional power holders. That repression pushed revolutionary ideology from perhaps advocating reasonable change to its own extremes of violence.
Our book begins with poets who criticize the Sakdena system for failing to live up to its own ideas. In the Sakdena system, the duty of leaders was to care for their followers, but some abused their power. One example what we look at is the long narrative poem Nirat Nong Khai, written by Tim Sukhayang. Tim criticized the actions of the top military leader, Chuang Bunnak, and the corruption of high-ranking officers. Despite the protection of an aristocratic patron, Tim was convicted of lèse-majesté and imprisoned for 8 months. He will never criticize the ruling class again.
We discuss in some detail the first Thai radical to incorporate Western ideas into his criticism of the Saktina system. In many ways, he was a man well ahead of his time. This was Tien Wanapo, a journalist in the 1800s. He called for an elected parliament, an end to elite economic privilege, equality for women, and a reform of Buddhism. He accused officials of corruption and incompetence. His writing outraged those officials. And as often is the case, they arranged his conviction on a minor technical offense. He spent 17 years in prison. When finally released, he published numerous books, many of which he had written in prison, and edited several political newspapers, all attacking traditional thinking and the traditional system of power. A short poem he wrote about power in the traditional system would not be out of place even in the 21st century. He wrote, "The rule of law will never surmount the rule of cliques, and the rule of cliques will never avoid the rule of suppression, and the rule of suppression will always be ruled by the breaking of necks."
Socialism was introduced to Thailand by a high-born diplomat, Phaya Suriyanuwat. In his book, Sapasat, he advocated a benevolent socialist economic system to control private capital and reduce the suffering of peasants. He called for government support of agricultural cooperatives and wrote that workers should have the right to strike. Although the star of the Thai diplomatic service, Phaya Suriyanuwat, was sacked during the sixth reign and his writing was banned.
So even the ruling class could not bring in new ideas that opposed the powers that be. And this suppression of ideas became a constant theme.
Yeah. That's what I said, that the radical thought in Thailand, in fact, was brought up by the, aristocrat, not by the proletariat, like Marx said. Okay, along with the rise of political newspapers, radical writers found a new medium of the novel, useful in promoting their social and political ideas. We describe how novelists use entertaining tales to call attention to social injustice. Among these writers, Gulab Sai Pradit was perhaps the most successful, writing increasingly radical, increasingly Marxist books for more than 40 years, until he fled into exile to China during the Tsarist regime.
We describe the ideas and personalities behind the very important 1932 overthrow of the traditional monarchy. Initially proclaimed as a political and social revolution, the coup leaders, however, failed to follow through with much real change. The first setback was the defeat of a socialist-inspired economic plan drafted by Pridi Phnomyong. Even Pridi later admitted that his plan was naive and unworkable. But the conservative success in rejecting that plan and nearly getting Pridi exiled energized remaining conservative forces in the aristocracy and the military. The coup group, the Kanat Rat, failed to organize as a mass political party, a critical failure that left the army as the best organized political group in the country. In 1979, Pridi told a journalist, "When I had power, I had no experience. And when I had more experience, I had no power."
We look at the ideological clashes in the decades after 1932. These conflicts were symbolized and driven by the differences between two leaders, in the Yuangrat, ปรีดี พนมยงค์ and แปลก พิบูล สงคราม ปรีดี led a civilian faction while พิบูล came to lead a military faction. Initially, good friends, their different visions of Thailand led them to become political enemies.
By the 1950s, conservative forces, backed by the power of the military, were in full control of the Thai government. But progressive thinkers continued to advocate ideas for radical change. Excluded from political and economic power, they depended on writing to undermine traditional ideas. We describe their efforts to attack class privilege and overturn the history written to glorify the ruling class. These writers called for a new kind of art. They demanded a more equal role for women. They advocated a type of Buddhism that was more rational and perhaps closer to the original teachings of the Buddha. These writers sought inspiration from Marxism. But because Marxist literature in Thai was quite limited at that time, they tended to misinterpret Marx. They called for both Western-style electoral democracy and a Marxist revolution. Such writing was frequently punished with newspaper closings, imprisonment, and even torture by the secret police. This repression further radicalized these thinkers, driving many to the more totalitarian ideas of Soviet and Chinese communism.
Many radical thinkers are described in our book, but none shone with more brilliance than Jit Pumisak. He was an intellectual who wrote groundbreaking works on language, literature, art, and history. He was beaten and imprisoned for his work. Once out of prison, he went into jungle to fight and finally died with the Communist Party of Thailand.
Our book tries to show how Jit and other radical thinkers saw traditional versions of history as tools mainly used to maintain ruling class power. They sought to rewrite that history in more Marxist terms. Their problem was that Thai history didn't fit very neatly into the phases of history as described by Marx based on European history. They were unfamiliar with Marx's writings about what he called the Asiatic mode of production. In fact, most of Marx's writing about Asia were suppressed by the Comintern, the Soviet-based international for the Communist Party. Marx had written that Asia would not follow the phases of historical materialism that he saw in Europe. That understanding would have undermined what Asian Marxists saw as the inevitable historical progression from current problems to socialism and then on to communism. So they simply ignored it.
We describe how the Thai radicals saw traditional art and literature as Sakdina class weapons to control society. To counter this, Jit and other radical thinkers call on Thai artists to become warriors. Their weapons would be a new kind of art for the people.
According to Jit, and this quote kind of captures the essence of art for the people, art that makes people think about their real lives and understand empirical reality leads people to create their class consciousness. That is true art for the people, that aims at serving people fighting the evil in life to create a better life.
One aspect of Marxism that most Thai radicals refused to accept was the rejection of religion. Our book shows how they sought to reinterpret both Marxism and Buddhism to highlight similarities and reduce differences. To them, Buddhism was much more than the opium of the people. They failed, however, to resolve the obvious contradiction between the peaceful meditation of Buddhism and the violent revolution of Marxism. Into the 1970s, the military stayed in power by launching coups and stacking parliament with their loyalists. The generals did their best to repress radical thinking. However, the ideas of Marxism, socialism, democracy, and equality still influence students, labor unionists, and even farmers. When political protesters were arrested in 1973, mass demonstrations brought down the military regime.
With rare exceptions, the student leaders of the October uprising were not initially communists, much less Maoists. Most were not even Marxists. They were considering various streams of thought in democracy, equality, socialism, and Marxism, as students do all over the world. We show how their thinking eventually evolved amid right-wing violence that culminated in the October 6, 1976 attack on student demonstrators at Homicide. And through that violence, their thinking became much more radical. And if you look at some of the faces on this slide, you'll see some of them are still active today.
The October 6 violence radicalized many students, making them feel there was no hope for peaceful political change. But there was a while they felt they had no choice but to join the armed insurgency of the CPT.
Here are a few extracts from our interviews you can read for yourself. The students' own Thai nationalism conflicted with the pro-Chinese ideas and attitudes of the CPT leadership. The students disagreed with the CPT's insistence on Maoist China as the only model for the Thai revolution. When we interviewed many of these people as they came out of the forest, this was the most common and most important theme of them. They felt they were Thai and the CPT leadership was Chinese. Many of the students retained an ideal of democracy based on what they had learned in university from the West. They were disappointed in their efforts to impact the ideology of the Thai Communist Party and outraged when the party leadership violated its own rules to maintain control at the time. Ideological disputes, of course, were not the only problems for the radicals and their CPT hosts. External events, driven by the Sino-Soviet dispute, opened the way for pragmatic Thai military leaders, General Gringside and General Brain. And they were very clever in undermining the appeal of the CPT. The students were alarmed to see communist brothers going to war against one another. Vietnam invading Cambodia and China invading Vietnam. At the same time, repression in Thailand was eased after the end of the Thanin government. And new elections were held. We show how these external developments added to the ideological conflicts the radicals already felt with the CPT, and that led to mass defections from the party.
We described the various paths taken by the radicals to join Thai society. For a decade, they were quiet. Then in 1992, the military's attempt to dominate political power led to big popular demonstrations. They gave the radicals a chance to return to political life. Once seen as failed communist revolutionaries, they were reborn as the defenders of democracy. But ideological differences among them had widened over the years. Some former radicals joined Thaksin and the red shirts. Others were drawn to the yellow shirt movement.
Marxist ideology is now largely ignored, and communism, even in China, looks a lot more like state capitalism than in the Marx imagined. The struggle over ideas continues in Thailand. That struggle is far from clear-cut. In fact, it's very messy, as Yuangrat just said. Some former communists became yellow shirts and some became red shirts. But this clash of ideas can still be discerned as a problem arising from the differences in key ideas. The ideas that evolved particularly from the Saktina system. Although that system itself was ended by Kim Chulalongkorn at the end of the 19th century, the spirit of that system, the thinking, the attitudes, still survive. Class privilege, bureaucratic control, elite capitalism, and official impunity. At the same time that concepts from the West, freedom, democracy, human rights, socialism, continue to play a role in Thai politics. We only hope that Thais will find ways to deal with their differences without any further violence. That gives you kind of an overview of what we deal with in the book. We look forward to questions. After the question period, we have copies of the book for sale, and we'd be happy to autograph them for you. And we're offering them at 500 baht a copy. If you go to the bookstore, particularly at the Open House bookstore in Central Embassy, they're on sale there, but it's 595 baht per book. And we also, you can buy them online. The paperback is $9.95, but plus shipping, and that's not cheap. The best bargain is the ebook for only $5. We also invite you to visit our website, which has a blog that we more or less irregularly put up there. But we also have all of the writing that Yuangrat did as a professor and as a researcher, and some of the things that I wrote as a journalist. Again, kind of ancient history, but if you're interested in history, you might find the website www.yuangratandpaul.online. The only thing we ask, whether you buy online or outside or at the bookstore, is we'd really would appreciate a few comments on the book posted on Amazon.com. So now we're happy to answer any questions you might have. ถ้าจะถามเป็นภาษาไทยเราก็ยินดีที่จะรับนะฮะ So open the floor.
So I wanted to ask actually, because your book was first published in 1970s, and the interviews were also, but the interviews were done in the 70s. And how much did you have to revise and add since for this edition?
Quite a bit, actually. When we wrote the book first, we did our research when Yuangrat and I both returned from the US in 1977. So very soon after the October 6th violence. And we were, she was doing research and I was doing reporting as the students defected from the CPT and as the CPT collapsed in Thailand. And we interviewed a lot of the key players. So that core remains much the same. But when we wrote, we were practically the first to write about this subject. But since then, there's been a lot more scholarly material, and also we've had access to some of the archives of the Communist Party So we have the same core material and I think the same ideas about it, but we now have much more material to support those ideas.
Okay, just to add on, in fact, our book is based on my PhD dissertation, the original copy. When I was writing it, I remember it was 1977 when we came back from America. Thanin government was really absolute, more than absolute monarchy, right? So I had a hard time digging all the Marxist books in Thailand. And so I did a lot of research by going to the police office, the Central Police. And I asked for those books that they confiscated from the bookstores, all kinds, they piled up in the chop house, a lot of them. So I went to ask the junior officer just to borrow some books. He was so kind. He said, go for it. So I was young, and I'm wearing my wedding ring. I'm wearing my wedding ring, and he said, go ahead. So I went there, and I wore my jeans and t-shirt and dig over all 5 rooms of all Marxist books in Thai, in English and German, which I also read. And then at the end, when I went 7 days, I hired the taxi to carry my books. The last day I went there to meet this young fellow, handsome guy. He said, the American culture is very good. Why? They show you if you are married by wearing rings. So he said, okay, I'm married, thank you. So I got the book through that. So after that, I finished my thesis. I had a scholarship, went to Singapore to be a researcher at Southeast Asian studies. And I got the fund to revise. And my classmates joined the CPT, right? I came back from Singapore, and my classmate was starting to come back from the jungle. So it was a good chance for us to interview those, about 30 of them, including Sek San, Pridi, all those big shots now, even now. So I have a chance to really sit down with them a couple hours to interview both Sek San and Kiranan, all those radical writers and thinkers, and who joined the Communist parties for at least 5 years and came back. So that is in fact, our second writing from my thesis. And the third writing is now, which is mostly done by Paul. He was more journalistic, writing, and he did a lot of research, interviewed people, and we updated. So 3/4 of this book is his writing. I'm doing only the research.
But many of the ideas are her. She's the expert on Marxism.
Congratulations on your book, first of all, and I'd like to ask, I think, a little bit of a tricky question. Were you free to write your real thoughts, or did the book have to undergo censorship?
I think, by and large, yes. The only exception is that we have to follow Thai law on min pramat, or lèse majesté. But that's true of anything published in Thailand. And the book initially was published in Thailand, and now it's published internationally. But so with that one exception, yeah, we wrote whatever we wanted.
Yeah. On top of that, when I just came back with my PhD thesis, Chawalit Yongchayut at that time, he was the prime minister or some army commander. He sent his staff to borrow my book and never returned. So I think he's very open-minded, and he realized that we are just a common scholar. We are not against the Thai government. In fact, my book is very against communism. It's very funny because when I first came back from America after 10 years, Thailand had changed a lot. I taught at Lam Kam Hang, and some students, they knew that I was teaching Marxism, Thai Marxism, using this book. and they assumed that I was one of those Marxists, communists. And they were radical students. They came to my office and trying to invite me to join the group, and asked them, do you really know what communism is? Would you like to work according to your ability and receive according to your needs? And they asked, what is that? Meaning that if you graduate from high school, you got salary 1,000 baht, but your needs is a lot. You have 3 children, you got paid 10,000 baht a month. But then the other guy who graduated from primary school, they have 7 children. They got paid more than you, even if both of you work very hard. So you got paid according to your needs, not according to your ability. Did you want to do that? After that, they disappeared.
In general, we've tried to be objective about the things that happened and to be as factual as possible.
In the beginning, you list radical thought from different ends of the political spectrum. Your presentation is all on the left. Do you do a parallel development on the right? And also, is it your thesis that there's a traditional Thai mind that is separate from the conservative mind that comes in from abroad?
Okay, good questions. Questions that we think about. Okay, so the first part of the question, I guess, is, now it's fled. Sorry, would you repeat the question? Yeah.
Do you do a parallel development of Western conservative thought as it came in the extremes, or even in moderation? And secondly, how does that meld with the Thai mind that's in your title?
Yeah. Do you mean Western conservative thought or Thai conservative thought?
It was your list.
Yeah.
Fascism?
Yes. Yeah. Certainly fascism, I guess, could be conservative.
Communists
Right.
explained clearly, but
Yeah.
was the resulting reaction to the communist a fascist reaction? You have parallels.
Yeah. I guess part of the answer is that yes, we believe there is I guess, an overgeneralization, but there is a Thai way of thinking. And that Thai mind interpreted the Western ideas that came in perhaps ways that changed them a little bit. And that was certainly true of fascism as well as Marxism. And I'm not sure there's a left-right scale here because they're both totalitarian and put government power ahead of people's welfare. But certainly fascism in the 1940s and 50s was an important part of the clash of ideas in Thailand. And the Marxist thinking was also interpreted as we mentioned. The Saktina hierarchical thinking was very much part of this Thai mind. And in fact, as we've thought about how this has evolved, there's not a single Thai way of thinking. There are many different ones, but one can draw a broad difference between the Saktina mindset, which basically was among the ruling class and in the cities. But there was also a Thai rural mindset that was not the same as the Saktina mindset. And we saw that difference come out into the open in the clashes between the red shirts and the yellow shirts. And the red shirts were again, it's not a left-right difference, but there were clear differences in the way the red shirts looked at things and the way the yellow shirts looked at things. And they're both Thai, so that was a part of it. But our thesis is that much of the conflict comes in as people try to absorb Western political thinking, whether Marxist or liberal democratic thinking, and how they interpret those, and what bits and pieces of Western thought they pick to use, whether because it fits with some belief they already have, or because it's a useful tool in their ambitions. So I'm not sure whether we fully answered that, but
yeah, that question is very, very good. In fact, that is the core of our writing. You use the word paralleling between Western ideas and Thai mind. Like Paul said, the ideas from Western, when the Thai radicals absorb Western ideas, they didn't have a chance to really get to the core or the roots of the knowledge of Marxism, democracy, or fascism, because what they learned, the Western idea is from second interpretation of Marxism or democracy. So with this illusion of democracy and Marxism, they think they are communist, or they are Marxist or democratic supporter. But in fact, they haven't, when I asked, interview more than 90% of them never read the Das Kapital or the Grundrisse or Asian mode of production. They have no ideas what Marx really said. They have learned from the Thai scholar who studied the translation of these ideas. Of course, the translation, a lot of things are not completely right or completely authentic Marx. Even Marx himself, before he died, a lot of critique, a lot of Marxist followers saying Marx said this, Marx said that. So Marx read what people think about his ideas. At the end he said, I think I'm not a Marxist. Because they all misinterpreted, right? The same as the Thai radical thinkers. They think they know Marxist very well. They think they know communist ideas, class struggle, or even the idea of religion, for example, very vivid example. They try to avoid what Marx said about religion, right? They're trying to integrate Marxist idea with Buddhist ideas, which is, in my book, we describe very clearly, it's very conflicting. Spiritualism and materialism never integrate together very well.
And this is similar to the ways that Marxism was changed in the Soviet Union, and Marxism was changed in Mao's China. And often what Thais got was a version of Marxism that came through Russia or Russian or Chinese writers. And so there was a number of changes along the way, and often in ways that increased the conflict in Thailand. But further questions? Yeah.
You alluded to reactions and responses to external events, and I wondered specifically, how did the students in the CPT react to the developments in Cambodia, Khmer Rouge, and so on, and what internal debates were there, and how did they play out?
Yeah, those debates were fierce within the party, particularly because the students were not fully under the control at least in terms of their thinking of the CPT leadership. Many said they were stunned and shocked by what happened under the Khmer Rouge. And there were some elements of the CPT that actually operated out of Cambodia, out of Khmer Rouge territory. I remember covering a firefight in eastern Thailand. That was, it was an attack by CPT forces, but they were CPT forces supported by the Khmer Rouge. So this was a very important part of it. Some of the people we interviewed said the stories they heard about what had gone on in Phnom Penh after the fall of the Lon Nol regime made them very worried that the same thing might happen in Thailand. So now they were really pulled in different directions. One, they were beginning to think that they would never win. But then they thought if we do win, it may even be worse. So it was a big issue.
Yes, in my book, I wrote with political science journals. It's called Cambodia, Marxism or Sadism. So I went with Paul to interview those victims, from the Cambodian regime. Khieu Samphan wrote a dissertation. He was a Marxist, trying to change Cambodia into ideal society of Marxists, meaning that everyone is equal. Okay, what he did was trying to apply his theory into practice. And the first few days, he wiped out all the Phnom Penh's bureaucratic citizens. So instead of making everyone equal by giving a chance to work, he tried to get rid of the rich people by making them all farmers. Everyone is growing farm in the university without any modern tools, right? So dig up the rice field with just simple, axe and everything. So a lot of people died in that day. In my article, I was trying to analyze that this is not really Marxist ideal society. It was extreme dictatorship, extreme mass murder. It's not really Marxist idea. So the Thai radicals, my students who at Thammasat, they asked me all sorts of questions in the classroom. They said, why it happened that way? Why? The simple answer is that Marx's theory of revolutionary is not based on Thai, Asian society, because we don't have a proletariat, the working class, a majority of the society who rebel against the bourgeoisie. We only have the peasants and the plain ordinary people. So everything we don't have, according to Marxist theory, to rebel against the society.
Thank you very much. That's very illuminating. I was interested in your slide you had on here that showed the leaders from the 70s who went into the jungles and then came back in both the red and the yellow parties. Can you explain a little bit more about why some of the leaders who were in the party, Communist Party, in the jungles, changed their philosophy over time and ended up in two different camps during the 2010?
Yeah, it's a complicated question, and we've done some research on that, and there's also been a very good PhD thesis written on exactly this issue. People came, part of the divisions, why they ended up in so many different camps, goes back to differences that date from the 1970s. It was not all unified. What unified them, what forced them to all go to the CPT, was the repression by the Thanin government and this fear, even before the Thanin government, of assassination and killing So they were kind of forced to look like they all agreed. In fact, there were disagreements. As well, when they came out of the jungle, they came out in different ways. Some defected by giving themselves up to the military, and they were controlled for a period of time. And most of those, particularly the well-known ones, went abroad for a period. And we note in the book all the different places they went. Not a single one of these leftist revolutionaries went to a Marxist country. They all went to Australia, France, the US, and Britain. So that was part of it. Others came out quietly and never gave themselves up and were never put through kind of a re-education by the Thai military. And then some came, particularly the people who were medical students, and a number of the radical leaders were doctors and nurses and so on. And in particular, Dr. Wang and Tida exemplified this. And they stuck with the Communist Party longer than some of the more well-known at that time leftists, and tried to make the CPT respond to their ideas. It was only when they actually won the vote at the party Congress in, I think, 1981. And then the top leadership of the CPT simply ignored the changes that were voted on at the Congress, and then they left. But they came out, and unlike some of the leaders like Seksan and Tirayut who went abroad, they joined the Thai Ministry of Health because they had the skill set. And others came out and had to make a living, so they joined private companies, or in many cases became journalists. So this history of where they went, whether they went abroad and became academics, whether they were medical practitioners and went back out into the countryside, whether they went into private business or into journalism, impacted what they wanted to do. Some always wanted to be politicians, and they worked their way back into the system through rather conservative parties. Several became members of the Democrat Party. For instance, Jataron joined the fairly conservative Democrat Party. He didn't stay long, and he hopped around to several parties before finally ending up with Thaksin's party. So Thaksin was able to particularly attract the medical practitioners and some of the journalists, but some of the journalists also joined the conservative faction. So I don't think there's one theory that explains everything, but certainly this coming out into different paths is one indicator of where they finally ended up.
Okay, just to add on what you said, I interviewed Therdphum Jaidi, who was the labor union leader before, and joined the Communist Party and defected, and joined Chawalit Yongchairut, who was the dominant military leader, who used to be very active in eradicate communists in Thailand. You can see a lot of Thai radicals change sides. You cannot pinpoint that, okay, you are communist, you cannot join the military. Military used to be their enemies, but now they become pals, work together very well. Why? A lot of outsiders are questioning why, not only the radicals, but a lot of Thais. I'm a Thai, maybe 1/4 Thai, but I still think that because the Thai people are very practical. We are very practical people. Once we want to do something, we don't cling on anything permanently. We can change sides, but deep in their mind, my book would say, Thai mind, right? Thai mind, meaning that we try to be communist, but you keep in yourself as a Thai. What do you want to be? But deep down in our heart, we are Thai, practical.
Up for the end of our session is 2:15, but because the next lecture has been postponed, we still have some time if anyone has questions.
I know this is probably a topic for a whole new conversation, but I have to ask, so can you talk a little bit about what's going on with radical thought and the Thai mind now?
I think
It's
the
a long
first thing
story.
to say is the changes in, particularly in China, but also in Vietnam and the Soviet Union, have had an impact. And now Marxism is, even though Marxism is discredited, at the same time that maybe socialism is becoming more influential. So that's one part of it, where some of the revolutionary aspects of Marxist thought has faded away. As that faded away, the Western liberal democratic thinking, I think, has come more to the fore, and we've seen that in the rise of the Future Forward Party. And we've seen the kind of resistance against it. Clearly, the Saktina mindset is still very powerful, and that gives the people in power an incredibly valuable weapon to use against their opponents, that the people on the top are on top because they know what they're doing, and they will eventually somehow help everyone else. And this kind of up and down the hierarchy set of obligations, where the puyai help the punoi, the top people have an obligation to help the less fortunate, and the less fortunate have to repay them with obedience and respect. And I think this clash is still very strong in Thailand, and it was interesting to see so many young people going against that Saktina mindset. So I think we're going to see more along that line of division. But there's also that other line, the difference between the Thai mindset out in the countryside and the Thai mindset in the cities is another line of fracture in Thai society.
To me, in my opinion, the radical thinking against conservative Saktina hasn't changed much now. As you can see, the new future parties, Thanathorn, being attacked by the conservative Saktina, using exactly the same tools in the past to get rid of him. So I think, just my personal opinion, that in general, we generalize, the Thai people are very conservative and afraid to change. So when change has come, it's about to come, they look at it very not so sure whether it's good or bad. And unfortunately, the people who are afraid of change is in power. So the people who want to change becomes victims. So I really hope that the change will really take place. Like I said, the Thai are very practical. So I look forward to the change, I hope in the near future.
Yeah, I think I put the slide up about Tianwan again, and you'll see that some of the ideas he advocated in 1870 still have not fully been accepted by many in the conservative establishment.
I'd be curious as to your view as to how the widespread social media has been a new medium of transmission of thought, for creating divisions, for creating audiences, and for allowing a diversity of ideologies to blossom.
First of all, we haven't done any focused research on this topic, but it's a topic of general influence, interest around the world. Certainly, we've seen what's happened in the US, and I suspect that in Thailand it's not too much different, that people tend to absorb the thinking that already accords with what they think. In other words, this idea that people gravitate to opinions that are similar to opinions they already hold. And this creates little silos of thinking. And I think that worsens this divide in mindset that we've already seen. And it, despite, I think, a general Thai predisposition to working things out, it'll make it more difficult. And it's always been kind of a shock to me, because when I was told that Thais are easygoing, they don't care much about ideology, and then we've seen time after time the country thrown into violence by thinking that is different from the establishment. So I can only fear that social media will worsen this, but there's no alternative. The only hope is that people will become, over time, more discriminating about what they read, or at least what they believe from what they read. And too often, as I think Yuangrat's about to say, they believe things they read online too easily.
Yeah, like I said, social media has become, I think, one of the most powerful instruments for whoever in power in Thailand. The simple thing is that the Thai people, we have this saying that ตามผู้ใหญ่หมาไม่กัด. Okay, you translate that, please.
Okay. If you follow the big shot, the dogs won't bite you.
So, whatever the big shot say anything, it's like your obligation to believe it without any questions, any conditions. Whatever happened in reality, if ผู้ใหญ่ said so, you have to believe the ผู้ใหญ่. You know that Thailand is the second largest population who use social media. I think after is in Japan or China, I don't know. But we use a lot of lines, and the first line for the old people because they don't know how to use the internet. So a lot of lines coming through. I've been using lines not for propaganda, but for my own research. I think 90% of people believe lies. So that is very dangerous for a country like this.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. But Kun Paul and Kun Yuangrat will be outside with their books and giving autographs, so maybe you can ask more questions there too. Thank you very much for your attendance. Our next talk is Kunji's Vasti's book, Last to the Front. So I hope you'll be here at 4 o'clock.